Hello, ladies and gents. We're on the modern political ideas, module DD316, the Open University, on page 23 of the book. Three Ideas of Englishness, Geoff Andrews. What does it mean to be English? Are there any durable or fixed English values? And in what ways are ideas of Englishness contested? Are there shared ideas of Englishness across different social groups? And, moreover, what do different ideas of Englishness tell us about how the nation should best be governed? How conflicts are resolved and prosperity and fairness achieved? What implications for the future of England and English identity can be derived from the evolution of political decision making to other UK nations? These are burning questions within and beyond the realm of political thought, and they continue to influence wider public debates, have gained added attention following the devolution of the nations within the UK after 1997, and during and after the referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union in 2016. The Englishness debate has deep roots and has brought forth a range of content. In this chapter, we will set out three different ideas of Englishness in the work of George Orwell, Roger Scruton, and Stuart Hall. In doing so, we will establish three perspectives which, while forging clear lines of distinction, also contain some unexpected overlaps in places. George Orwell, page 24, chapter 2, Three Ideas of Englishness. Writing in 1940, at a time when highly civilized human beings are flying overhead, trying to kill me, George Orwell, an English writer from a lower upper middle class background and a socialist who spent considerable time documenting impoverished working class communities, set out a view of what it meant to be English. When you come back to England from a foreign country, you have immediately the sensation of breathing a different air. The beer is bitter, the coins are heavier, the grass is greener, the advertisements are more blatant. The crowds in the big towns, with their mild, knobbly faces, their bad breath and gentle manners, and different from a European crowd, then the vastness of England swallows up Europe. And you lose for a while your feeling that the whole nation has a single identifiable character, and the diversity of it, the chaos, the clatter of clogs in the Lancashire mill towns, the to and fro of the lorries on the Great North Road, the queues outside the labour exchanges, the rattle of pin tables in the Soho pubs, the old maids biking to Holy Communion through the mist of the autumn mornings. All these are not only fragments, but characteristic fragments of the English scene. Despite the diversity he alludes to here, Orwell is adamant that there are clearly definable and seemingly timeless English features. In his view, the English dislike abstract thought, jealousy, preserve their privacy, and spend their leisure time collecting stamps, playing darts, drinking in pubs, and enjoying cups of tea. Solid breakfasts and soup puddings, their gentleness leads to an aversion to war and preference for friendly bus conductors and unarmed policemen. There is hypocrisy, too, in Orwell's England of 1941. In the English attitude to the empire and the wars of persecutions it caused. He also conceded that there are different national traits among social classes, the nonconformist outlook of what he called the common people. For example, brought scepticism of religious hierarchies, opposition to militarism, and contempt towards official abuse of the law. At the same time, it produced inveterate gamblers who drink as much beer as their wages will permit, are devoted to border yokes, and use probably the foulest language in the world. One group Orwell thought generally incapable of patriotic feeling was the left wing. Intelligentsia, which he attributed to the emotional shallowness of people who lived in a world of ideas and have little contact with the physical reality. This is mentioned in Orwell 1941, page 47. Most important feature of the Englishness intelligentsia, according to Orwell, was their severance from the common culture of the country, which resonates perhaps with some more recent criticisms of the so-called liberal metropolitan elite. Inattention at any rate, the English intelligentsia are Europeanized. They take their cookery from Paris and their opinions from Moscow. In a general patriotism of the country, they form a sort of island of descendant thought. England is perhaps the only country whose intellectuals are ashamed of their own nationality. In left-wing circles, it is always felt that there is something slightly disgraceful in being an Englishman, and that it is a duty to snigger at every English institution. From horse racing to suet puddings, it is a strange fact, but it is unquestionably true that almost any English intellectual would feel more ashamed of standing to attention during God Save the King than of stealing from a poor box. In Orwell's view, relatively humongous national unity was possible. Indeed, he believed that in England, up to a point, the sense of national unity is a substitute for a world view. From a troubled vantage point of a nation at war, Orwell argued that the peace to come would be followed by a socialist revolution. He viewed the old England as ridden with class privilege, economic inefficiency, and a willingness to change its ways. The existing English nation, he felt, was a family in which the young are generally thwarted, and most of the power is in the hands of irresponsible uncles and bedridden aunts, a family with the wrong members in control. That perhaps is as near as one can come to describing England in a phrase. This is mentioned in Orwell 1941, page 35. The English Revolution he advocated would be socialised, one involving nationalisation of land and transportation to restrictions on high incomes, large-scale educational reform and Indian independence. It would not be led by communists who abuses of power he had recently experienced during the Spanish Civil War and would depict in his latter books, Animal Farm and 1984. It would be a revolution on English terms, where patriotism is usually stronger than class hatred, and always stronger than any kind of internationalism. Orwell 1941. It is to say, a non-doctrinaire, law-abiding patriotic revolution, but a revolution nevertheless, in which the House of Lords, but not the monarchy, but it would be abolished, and its inspiration would come from skilled workers, technicians, and professionals. Orwell did not get his revolution, but the Labour government, elected in 1945, did carry out some of the measures he advocated before his death in 1950. Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton, a former professor of philosophy at Birkbeck College, University of London and prominent English conservative thinker agreed with Orwell on some of the core characteristics of Englishness, but disagreed with his conclusion on how England should be governed. Why Orwell was trying to set out what England needed a post-World War. Scruton was looking back on what its politics, including its socialist legacy, had delivered. It was gloomy about what nation had become in the 1990s, as Orwell had become about its condition in the 1940s. Though for quite different reasons, he shared Orwell's view that the English were very sceptical of theories, were characterized by their self-deprecating humour, and displayed only example of abstract reasoning was reflected in the importance given to the common law over written constitutions or civic republicanism in the history of English government. The English character was profoundly influenced by the common law. For English people, the law was an objective reality. It did not depend upon the will of sovereigns or parliaments, but stood in a judgment upon them. When a felon transgressed, it was not the state, but the law which pursued him. And the essential of goodness of the law was symbolized by the fact that policemen carried no arms. This was mentioned in Scruton 2001. The significance of common law, according to Scruton, was that it put the emphasis on the individual's responsibility. The extraordinary result was that while the English believed in law and authority, they despised officialdom and distrusted the state in Scruton 2001. Instead, they preferred amateur initiatives and relied on civil associations, clubs, and friendly societies. The little platoons, in the words of the political theorist and Anglo-Irish politician Edmund Burke, to resolve social problems. According to Scruton, the English system of government had historically enshrined the values of individual responsibility and toleration. It had been shaped by custom while remaining open to compromise. Its unwritten constitution had been modified over time by institutional experience. This had even won the admiration of foreign philosophers like Montesquieu and Voltaire. Moreover, unlike Orwell, Scruton saw the positive virtues in England's class structure. England was an aristocratic society in the very real sense that it possessed a hereditary aristocracy decorated with titles, privileges, and political power, and endorsed by a political system which treated aristocracy as a genuine honour, to be bestowed upon those who had deserved well of the state. But it was also an aristocratic society in a more subtle sense. It distinguished well-bred from ill-bred behaviour, and believed in well-bred behaviour as the social moral idea. He saw the hereditary principle as modifying the imperfections of modern democratic systems. Not all legitimate interests can be catered for by voting, and the large hereditary components in the English constitution were in part an acknowledgement of this. How, for example, can you represent the interests of dead and unborn Englishmen merely by counting the votes of the living? And how, in a system where important issues are determined by majority voting, do we protect the descendant minority, the individual eccentric, the person who will not or cannot conform? One of the great achievements of the English system of government was that it fostered a society in which no real conformity was required, except the conformity to law. It is not by design, but by the invisible hand of tradition and compromise, that this tolerant system arose. Writing 60 years after Orwell had argued the need for an English socialism, Scruton mourned the loss of core English values and the dismantling of English institutions and customs. The idea of England was not only in decay, but now often forbidden by the English themselves. Where in 1941 Orwell had lamented the refusal of left wing intellectuals to embrace an English identity. In 2001, Scruton argued that this reluctance had extended more widely. Some of the erosion of English values he believed resulted from the loss of sovereignty to the European Union, while he also blamed the Scottish and Welsh devolution policy of the 1997 Labour government. Devolution, when it came, was not so much a gesture in favour of the Welsh and the Scots as a gesture against England. The Scottish and Welsh members of Parliament kept their seats at Westminster, so retaining full power to legislate for the English, even though the English have only diminished ability to legislate for Scotland and Wales. For Scruton, the impact of globalisation, notably through the erosion of national cultural traditions, the political and legal impositions of the European Union, and the preference of continental or American values, including the emphasis on transparency. Liberal laws and human rights legislation have produced a sense of guilt among the English, including in the BBC, the national broadcaster. As a result, this suggested the English values and characteristics Orwell had described in 1941 were now disappearing. Gone are the habits, the stiff upper lip, the aloof sense of duty, the instant assistance to the stranger in distress that went with imperial pride. Gone are the institutions, the village shop, the market, the Saturday night dance, the bandstand in the park, through which local communities renewed themselves. Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall, cultural studies theorist and former Open University professor, had a different view of Englishness from both Orwell and Scruton. The starting point for Hall, a Caribbean-born, Oxford-educated New Left thinker, was to recognise that Englishness was now a contested terrain. That is to say, different meanings and assumptions had been applied to it and were continually open to debate. For Hall, the important influence on his understandings of Englishness were his background in Jamaica, but his studies as the Rhodes Scholar in Oxford in the early 1950s to break up the British Empire and sweeping social and cultural changes, which were transforming what it meant to be English. Race had become increasingly significant in British politics since the 1960s, illustrated by Not Powell's The Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. Frequent debates about the implication of a large-scale immigration and connection between ethnicity and crime made by politicians and newspaper editors. In response, anti-racism movements had opposed the narrow concept of Englishness and what were perceived as simplistic connections between race and nation. At the same time, the ethnic diversity of the UK had brought more complex identities, values, and characteristics of more contemporary Englishness. The seemingly fixed, humongous picture of Englishness suggested by Orwell and Scruton and others was now contested by what some referred to as multiculturalism, itself as a contested term. As he put it in John Alcomafra's 2013 film about his life and work, the Stuart Hall Project. When I ask anybody where they're from nowadays, I expect them to be told an extremely long story. I think identities are endless, unfinished conversations. Hall puts down his ambivalence of Englishness to the moment of which his arrival in the UK, when what we call the Imperial Centre was in decline. A Jamaican with a school education based on traditional English values. He arrived in Britain in the 1950s at the end of the Britain Empire, but for the first time we were not mesmerised or cowed by it because we could, as it were, see around its edges to a time beyond empire. Hall and Swartz 2017. This meant that his experience and estimation of traditional English values differed markedly from both Orwell and Scruton. I don't really get the deep structures of Englishness, what governed its styles and social interactions, its reservations, ironies and ambiguities, its silences and evasions. I didn't understand how the place hung together. I knew about its stereotypical British stiff upper lip, but what impressed me more immediately was the tested way English inhabited their bodies, a settledness in place, a visceral resistance to movement, a fluidity to letting go. Hall's Caribbean background meant that he, along with others, could never share any kind of homogeneous English identity. For him, the contested terrain of English meant that the attempts simply distinguished between a more radical or conservative interpretation of Englishness were not the issue. It was contempt itself was the problematic. This convinced Hall that he could never become English. However, British was a term he could accommodate, despite colonisation and all its imperial connections. In any case, the relationship between England and other nations of the UK was itself a set for internal colonisations, nestling inside the larger one. In other words, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland had existed under a form of domination, and their national identity, political sovereignty, and economic prosperity had scuffed as a result. English Englishness contemporary debates. George Orwell, Roger Scruton, and Stuart Hall had put forward contrasting ideas on Englishness, derived from different interpretation of what constitute English values and characteristics, the nature of an English identity or sense of belonging. And the long and tenuous relationship between Britain and its empire and those between the nation within the UK. They offer competing views across the spectrum of the left and right, which might be classified as radical. Orwell restorative, Scruton, and post-colonial Hall. As such, while the originality of their ideas on Englishness has been distinctive and influential as a part of their wider thinking, they loosely correspond to different ideological traditions. The question these three thinkers addressed over 70 years have received greater scrutiny in political debates since the 1990s. This is partly a result of 1990 devolution policies put in practice by 1997 Labour government under Tony Blair, which gave powers to the new Scottish Parliament, the National Assembly for Wales, Welsh Assembly, and the beloved government in Northern Ireland. In the wake of devolution, more questions on should be happening in England were raised among commentators, politicians, and campaigners. Some pointed to the problem of West Lothian question whereby Scots and Welsh MPs would continue to vote on English matters, but English MPs would be denied reciprocal decision-making powers. The issue could be seen as a factor in the rise of what some describe as a new form for English nationalism, notably in the ideas of United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP. For others, devolution for Scotland and Wales inspired a new interest in the radical traditions of Englishness, which some trace back to Levellers, the 17th century political movement, which come to prominence during the English Civil War for its arguments for suffrage, greater equality before the law, and religious tolerance. Devolution after 1997 heralded a moment when core English values could be defined and rediscovered. However, a Michael Kenny 2014 had argued, the resurgence of interest in Englishness since the 1990s had not been solely a result of devolution, but rather had marked a deeper shift in the attitudes towards Britain and a weakening of British identity. The abandonment of empire had been conducted successfully and without too much political fallout in the decades after 1945, but had bequeathed nagging questions about what now were the causes and enterprises for which the kingdom needed to be united, and a greater generational distance was established from the collective memory of the patriotic moment associated with the Second World War. Uncertainty about the purposes and international role of the UK made its way to the political mainstream. The revival of interest of English was broad and crossed different fronts as part of what might be called a reimagining England. The cultural theorist Benedict Anderson used the phrase an imagined political community to describe the feeling of fraternity and belonging which bind the shared identity of the members of a nation. Anderson, 1983. The 1990s illustrate this as well. In the sphere of culture, art and sport, a new Englishness was conceived at a cultural level through such forms as identification with St George's Day, with calls for it to be national holiday, renewed celebration of Morris dancing and novels such as Julian Barnes, England, the singer Billy Bragg, author, the progressive patriot. He called for a progressive Englishness, one which builds a radical aspect, history, nosebleed movement, the campaigns for universal suffrage, the support for values of multiculturalism. Without such a progressive patriotism, Bragg argued the debate would be dominated by right-wing nationalists. The end of difference associated with events such as death of Prince Diana in 1997 also contributed to a renewed sense of Englishness, which ruffled the constraints of traditional institutional authority. Changing attitudes to monarchy was one simple, while dilution of public esteem for BBC and the NHS were others. There is some statistical evidence to suggest that since the 1990s there has been a stronger identification with England rather than with Britain, with citizens more willing to identify themselves as English than as British. And at the same time, there was what Kenny calls a running of British sentiment. Kenny 2014, through many responders across several surveys, still identifies both British and English. These